Welcome to this second in the Our World Reimagined series of conversations hosted by the Glasgow Council for Voluntary Services. To kick us off, I'd like to introduce Chief Executive Officer Ian Bruce.
Thanks, Penny. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for the second of these events. Last week's event went exceptionally well, so the standard's definitely been set for Cormac Russell, who's joining us today to talk about asset-based community development. The whole point of this series of events for us is very much around challenging people across sectors and across both Glasgow and Scotland to think about how we can create a better society for the people in the city beyond COVID. So I'm really looking forward again to today. That's all I want to say, because I do want to keep this short because we have an hour and people are here to hear from Cormac and not from me. So back to you, Penny. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Pennie Taylor. I am a journalist and a health and social care specialist here in Scotland. And it's incredibly clear to me, as a result of all the work I've done over the years, that community is critical, and never more critical than now. Last week we heard about community wealth building, and I have to say I've been thinking about it all week and bringing it into my conversations with people. This week we're going to be looking at and talking about asset-based community development with a world-leading expert on that subject. Before we turn to Cormac Russell, I thought it might be really useful to run delegates through how you can engage in this conversation. If you run your cursor over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see an icon for questions and answers. If you click on that, it opens up the questions that people are asking. Just move it over to the side of the screen if you want. That's where you would put a question that you might want to pose to Cormac Russell. If you want to use the chat function, click on that button and it'll bring up a panel, hopefully, yes it does, where this is for conversations between delegates, or to post relevant links, or to make comments that aren't actually questions. So please feel free to use those, because we will have chance to go into in greater depth angles on what we're going to be hearing from Cormac to apply locally. Now, Cormac Russell is you're speaking from Dublin, yeah? You're based in Ireland?
I am, Penny. I'm in Dublin at the moment.
Great. Now, you're an expert on asset-based community development, otherwise known as ABCD. Before we go into your talk, can you just describe to us, for people who've never heard it before, what do we mean by that?
Well, in simple terms, we're thinking about very local places and the people who live there and how they can be effective when they work together.
That's a very succinct explanation of it, and very relevant to a lot of the conversations that are happening in Scotland. You've got a book that you are launching, in fact, here today. So thank you very much for that. And we're going to hear more about that later. But we're going to have 10 minutes of hearing from Cormac Russell about ABCD. Take it away, Cormac.
Thank you, Penny. That's great. Well, you see here I've got a 3D presentation prepared. So what I have in my hand are pieces of wood, pieces of kindling that I gathered this morning in the woods near my house. I just want to use these as a simple metaphor for kicking us off. And the idea, the big idea that I have that I'd like to share is that big is the problem, and that what we need to do is make small the new big. Now, one of the things that I think has happened is, in a sense, it's almost a parody, isn't it? With big society and whatnot, that we want to shape the conversation across the aisles of right and left, whatever it is we're talking about. And so if we're talking about affirming community, it means somehow we're talking down government. And if we're talking up government, it means we're talking down community. And in a sense, what I want to say is that really we need to figure out how to be in right relationship, and how we get all of the assets that are available to us working effectively. But to do that in a way that builds on the principle of subsidiarity. So certainly when it comes to a government as an institution, the last thing we want is our governments to be predatory, right? Or to be gaslighting their citizens, as is happening in some countries where when at one level they're being told go out and fuel the economy and eat as much as you can, and then when COVID spreads, they're being held responsible for being reckless. We want the opposite of that. So we want a government, whatever the opposite of gaslighting is, to act in an enabling way and to really instill a democratic movement. Where I see us really struggling is I think we're living through an inversion of democracy. I'm not saying that's true in Scotland. I mean, in general terms in Western countries, where typically speaking, the role of citizen is being defined as that which happens after the important work of professionals is done. And sometimes that's also true in the third sector. So the assumption is that my health is in the hands of a doctor, that my child's education is in the hands of a teacher, that my conflicts are in the hands of a lawyer or a solicitor, and so on. And what I want to propose is that's the wrong way around, that demos kratia, the power to the people idea, suggests that in fact the role of the professional and the institutional world, while really important, should be defined as that which happens after the important work of the citizen is done. In other words, if we're really serious about democracy as opposed to technocracy, where the technocrats are the ones in charge and the ones that know, and sometimes the ones that know are the very well-intentioned people who are flying the flag of social justice and saying, we're better placed to be your voice, as opposed to a third sector that says, we are the amplification system, but ultimately your voice is your voice. And our job is to enable you to organize that voice and to amplify that with you, not for you. And I think if that's the case, what we need to figure out is how to move past the medical model of government and of governance and figure out how we actually create a dome of protection around communities to do what? Well, to light their own fire, using their kindling, using the assets that exist in the local context of community. Now, this doesn't mean, to go back to Neil's point of last week, this doesn't mean that communities don't need outside support or don't need, the precipitation. But what it does mean is that the orientation, the measure of success, isn't how many clients we have in how many programs, but it's the extent to which the people we serve are as interdependent at the center of natural communities as possible, whereby they're the producers of their social capital and their wealth capital. And agencies, institutions are there supporting that to happen. So I think there's a real alignment between what you were talking about last week in terms of wealth creation and what we're talking about this week. Asset-based community development, in a sense, I kind of think about it as a philosophical viewpoint as well as a practical set of practices. And one of the challenges, I suppose, that we encounter in our work in different countries is it feels a lot of the time when we're talking about community building that we've got lots of ideas about different applications. It's almost like we've got all the apps, but the smartphone is missing. And in my mind, the smartphone is the small bounded place. It's the village, it's the neighborhood. It's not the individual, it's not a target group, and it's not the institution. It's the neighborhood or the neighborhood scale. So what we're really talking about when we talk about an asset-based approach is something that isn't just about the strengths of individuals. When we're talking about asset-based community development, we're talking about the assets of individuals who live there, the assets of their associations, their clubs, their groups, their social networks, the institutions in terms of the local economy, the for-profit, not-for-profit governmental institutions, and then the economy and the culture and the stories of the place. And I suppose the real challenge is, how do we support communities to discover, connect, and mobilize those assets so that communities being hatched economically and practically in terms of well-being from inside out, not outside in. The final thought, just to conclude my opening remarks, is I use a metaphor in my book of the nursery rhyme Humpty Dumpty to try to elucidate what I'm talking about. And I suggest that our first masterclass in asset-based community development was through that nursery rhyme. And of course, we all know it ends badly. So in a sense, what I'm saying in this is that all the king's horses and all the king's men, however well-intentioned, can't put us back together.
Have we lost?
Side.
Oh, no, hi, Cormac. I think you dropped off briefly then. Would you mind just repeating what you said over the last sort of minute and a half?
Oh, of course, of course.
Sorry, or minute.
No worries, Penny, I'd be happy to. So is the connection better now?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So I'm just using the metaphor of Humpty Dumpty. And I was saying that it feels to me like an awful lot of the conversation that we're having is focused on the service side of the wall. So we're talking about how we can get the king's horses and king's men working more effectively, procuring more effectively. It's always about services. And what I want to do is to say that's fine insofar as it goes. There's nothing wrong with that. But in isolation of a wider conversation, it becomes really problematic and institutionalizing. If we jump over onto the other side of the wall, I'm inviting people to imagine that potentially the work on the other side of the wall is to support the hatchers and the catchers, to grow an associational nest. And in a sense, the final thought on this, what I want to suggest is that what we're trying to figure out, certainly in the book that I'm writing, I'm trying to expand a parody of ABCD, which some people who are against it have really cultivated, which says, what we're saying is ABCD is about promoting community at the expense of government. We're essentially anarchists abroad, and we just want to, you know, promote a neoliberal agenda and get rid of the state. Aside from the fact that it's ill-advised and it's misguided, it's mischievous to say that because it's just not true. What we are saying is that change, social change and social justice is contingent on understanding that we're traveling on a 3-lane highway. And on one lane, there are things that communities are best placed to do together alone. Our job is to remove the barriers, not do onto them. That in another lane is co-production. There are things that we can do really well and that we can do even better when we have the support of outside actors and agencies. And in the final lane, there are a whole range of institutions, including the institutions of the state, that absolutely need to do things for us. So my final postulation, my theory of change, and it's very practical as well as theoretical, is we can't know what communities need done for them until communities themselves know what they can do for themselves. And that's the big challenge of an enabling state.
Thank you so much, Cormac Russell. Actually, I think this is a great time to talk about your book, the book you're launching today, the title being Rekindling Democracy, the subhead on that being A Professional's Guide for Working in Citizen Space. Is this a handbook? Is this a toolkit for individuals working in this space?
Well, it's written in a sense to be both conceptually helpful and practically useful. So it's that mixture between saying, you know, if we're going to argue in favor of changing social order as opposed to just peddling programs and services, we need to be pretty articulate with regard to defending that position. So it makes the case, while at the same time also spelling out through stories and practices how we can do that.
Yeah. And, you know, who's publishing it? Why now? And what's the audience? Is there a global audience for this?
Well, it was published in June. Cascade Books are my publishers. And really, you know, we're at that stage about 2 months into the current pandemic. But, you know, we've been thinking for at least a decade in pandemic conscious ways. Anybody who's been working in public health and working with communities has known, you know, that we need to think in these terms. However, I did not predict COVID-19, that's for sure. So I wrote the book before this really kicked in. And it's been really striking as we're going through the current challenges that we're going through, how many people are coming back from different parts of the world saying this is a real currency in the here and the now. Not just in terms of public health crisis, but also it really feels very current. I think of George Floyd's words of, I can't breathe. And I think they're as applicable in the economic challenges and indeed with regard to the inclusion challenges that we're working through at the moment.
Now, before we go into this further, there are a large number of participants listening to you as we speak, and I just wanted to remind people how they can post questions. If you scroll to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A logo. Click on that and it allows you to ask a question. You can do that anonymously if you wish. You just tick a box and it comes up. So please engage in the conversation, because if you don't have any questions, I sure have loads. So I wanted to talk before we get into, there's a question come up that I will ask. You identified some vested interest there. You know, you're not only up against the people who want us to go back to the old normal because it suited them best, but, you know, there's also professional vested interest. I mean, some of what you're saying could be taken as real criticism by people that already work in the field of, you know, community empowerment, consultation, engagement. I recently interviewed a young man who lives in a very deprived community in the East End of Glasgow, and during COVID, he and his friends got together and once a week put on a fantastic party for the community. They did it socially distanced, they did it in every possibly respectful way of COVID. But here's a quote towards the end of his piece that for me chimes with everything you've been saying. He says, we've seen so many outsiders come into places like this over the years to deliver their problem-solving magic. They hit us with their buzzwords, and when they move on, things always go back to the way they were. The difference this time is this is being led by people who really know the community, and we know that we can do better than any outsider organization can do for us. There are lessons to be learned from that. For me, he's just articulated ABCD in a really accessible way. Would you agree?
Yeah, except there's more nuance to it. So I mean, the critique of the safari, poverty safari, is valid in a lot of instances. But I think on balance, it might also be said that there is another style by which professionals can show up in communities, which isn't about being an outsider and doing onto or pretending to be a member of the community and trying to be an insider. And it's what I call the alongsider. So I think on balance, it is important to say that we're not saying, I'm certainly not saying to professionals get out of the road. And I do think that some people interpret ABCD that way. And some of that is because of how it's written in the North American parlance and style. You know, it's very community organizing, sling your hook, jog on your bike. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if we're on a 3-lane highway, please indicate before you cross over, because it feels a little bit like a spaghetti junction at the moment. And some things that are being done in order to help community are actually about harvesting capable people and turning them into clients rather than lifting them up as citizens. So there is a nuance. And I suppose what I want to be careful is, I'm not saying we don't need institutions or we don't need professionals. The question as to, you know, well then what are you saying? What do we need institutions and professionals to do? Well, I think it's a pivot away from providing services to or for people to starting with precipitating, say, take the example you just gave there, precipitating folks to do what they can and want to do with their neighbors first. And then from there, figuring out what supplementary supports are required to extend that capacity. What I would contend has happened previously is we have not taken care to find out what the capacity is. We've just focused on the deficits and the needs, and then we've defined the solutions in our institutional language and interventions. And that's where disablement comes in.
Now, because we've been doing that for so long, it's a big ask to, you know, to say to people, you know, you really have to change the way you work, nicely or more directly. I think that relates to a question that's come in from Ruth Bradley, who says, what would your best advice be to a local authority, adult social care in particular, but also generally, about their place in this? Is there a role? Do we just get out of the way? Do we open up conversations? Welcome thoughts on relationship and tensions between advocating strengths-based approaches, individual and asset-based work.
So the answer is, I believe there is a role, and it's kind of pivoting away from being the deliverer of services to being the convener of conversations that move into discovering assets. So it's almost sequential, you know, that if you imagine that there are three questions that we can engage any social change issue or effort around. The first is, what can the people who are living with the experience and the consequences of it do themselves together if they're supported? First question. Or maybe even do alone if they're just left alone. The second question is, what can they do with some outside help? And the third question is, what do they need done for them? What I would say to Ruth is, the first challenge is to get that sequence lined up, because currently there's probably a very strong likelihood that the very large institutions in Scotland are asking the third question, what can we do for you? And they're calling that empowerment, right? And what that's actually doing is it's eclipsing the capacity of community, and it's engaging with people as though they're consumers of services, active or otherwise. And all you end up with then is co-design and co-production, which isn't the same as asset-based community development, although it's a close sister. But you can't have co-production unless you first have community building. So that's the first. The second, I think, is to pivot away from this kind of notion that, because Ruth is asking the question from a local government perspective, this notion that local government is primarily about the the provision of statutory services, as if that's the only way to distribute wealth. You know, I mean, it really strikes me, particularly in social care, how many times I'll say to a social care professional, if the person you're serving had your salary, would they use your salary to buy the service you're proposing for them? And the answer almost universally is no. So there's a hint in there, you know, about where the core of the issue is. Often what people need is income, not service. So kind of pivoting to precipitating community building. One of the things I really worry about in Scotland, to be quite honest with you, is that there's a proliferation of strength-based approaches and asset-based approaches that about 10 years ago, almost in the zeitgeist, and this was driven a lot by social care and by health folks in Scotland, they chopped off the community development of asset-based community development, and we ended up with asset-based approaches, which is kind of a bit like the social version of positive psychology, and it really grinds my gears because you're essentially chopping off the radical root of the work. So I think one of the things that I would say about local government is a lot of local governments are too big, institutionally too big, to be able to precipitate the level of community building we're talking about. But what they can do is they can find intermediaries, that there are institutions that are small enough to be trusted and embedded in the community, but institutionally capable enough to manage funding and employment and things of that nature. And in a sense, a lot of the bigger institutions, while well-intended in terms of individuals, I think what they do is they create antibodies to kill off the kind of innovation that we're talking about. And so a trick, I think, would be, just speaking to Ruth directly, is if you can find, it's almost about knowing all progress in this work is about understanding the limits of our capacity, and the bigger our institutions, the harder it is to do this small, localized relocation of authority. But there are embedded intermediaries that we could relocate some of the functions to. The final thought, Penny, just this is important. I would say to local authorities, and this is a real challenge to third sector, don't treat third sector organizations as though they're a proxy for community. They may be an embedded intermediary. The best of them know how to do the community building really well, but the really good ones will never ever claim to be the voice, or will never solve problems that don't belong to them. And so I think there's some thoughts around that.
I want to come back to a question about community, but I want wonder if I could just ask you at this point, would you say then that what we should be doing is reviving community development, which has pretty much been dismantled, but send people into developed communities again?
Yes, but this time don't let it be medicalized.
Okay.
I think one of the things that happened with community development is very early on, it sort of got pulled into mission creep. And while there is a very strong argument for saying, well, let's be very intentional about target groups and supporting advocacy groups or affinity groups to galvanize their own powers and issues, there's nothing wrong with that. But what seemed to happen in around the late 80s, early 90s, is we pulled away from place-based community development, as we did with patch social work, as we did with patch policing, as we did with pulling GP surgeries. So essentially, we really disembedded all of the resources in local places, and we made community development about the issues and not just, you know, about the place and the issues. And I think we need to re-embed again.
For its own sake, yeah. Yes. A related question, what have you found or seen to be the most effective and or useful methods of evaluating ABCD, particularly from a local government and authority perspective? And then we'll move on from that particular perspective.
Well, one of the things about evaluation is always the willingness to move away from the classic evaluation structures of summative and formative evaluations, which, to be honest, exist because an awful lot of evaluation is a tool of oppression. It's about auditing people rather than actually learning. So the methodologies that I would advocate for are ones that really do two things. One is they enable learning, and two, they support people to feel a real sense of ownership over the data and over the learning that kind of is created. So developmental evaluation, developed by Michael Patton in Canada, is really, really useful, because it says that if you're doing good community building, good community development, evaluation is part of that. We're constantly learning, we're constantly making mid-course corrections, and that's to be celebrated, not to be punished. The other is realist evaluation. I think it's a very, very practical way of saying, let's get into the context. When you've seen one community, you've seen one community. One of the things I fear a lot is when I see evaluations being used to make an argument for scaling up and standardizing of models. So when we're evaluating, all models are wrong, some are useful. Thankfully, ABCD is not a model, though some people have tried to turn it into a model. It's an approach. So it's a description, an ethnographic description of what people do when they're effective and powerful together. So to an extent, I think the evaluation needs to be about story and narrative too. So the third methodology I'd advocate is stories of significant change.
Yeah, hearing from the people themselves, impact. A related question from Jim Moynihan, One Church. How to engage and motivate government agencies with ABCD? You know, these are the people that want evidence and evaluations that fit existing boxes. That's my addition to that question, by the way. Jim didn't say that. They seem open to ABCD as long as the principles help them mobilize residents, but without sharing any real power. Co-production is too much of a paradigm shift. Do you think? Is that you recognize that?
Well, I do, and I think there are exceptions to this rule. So I think we have to find where the energy is and go with that. I'm always hopeful, but I never ever expect a government en masse to change anything, good or bad. But finding spaces and places where we can kind of cultivate the change. What you would be looking for, a way of thinking about this is, what would we see in a senior public servant as behaviors that really suggest we're moving in this direction? I think what we'd see is the relocation of three things. Not just responsibility, which is a lot of actually what's happening. You know, we think like if I say I'm going to empower you, who's got the power?
Yeah.
I do, right? So the Community Empowerment Act, even linguistically, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because what we're talking about here is creating the conditions for collective empowerment at the grassroots level. Now, if that's the case, as well as relocating responsibility, we've also got to be prepared to relocate authority and resource. And that's when you know it's game on. When you're seeing folks saying, for example, see, you know, the Scottish Prison Service saying, we know that it's the same 15 postal codes from which our alumni come. Let's do some community building work in those postal codes. Well, that's somebody saying, I'm actually going to launder or relocate money and authority from incarceration to community alternatives. And when we start seeing that, then we'll start seeing change happen. Can I give you an example of this, Penny, outside the Scottish jurisdiction? That's very current at the moment.
I want to move through the questions, Cormac. So
okay.
Yeah, keep it
just
really
quickly. Defunding police at the moment with regard to Black Lives Matters in the States, and we're involved in some of the conversations. Very interesting. So the narrative at the moment is this, and this is where framing and power is really important. The narrative is we want to defund the police, which is kind of code for let's take some of the money away from enforcement and relocate it to mental health intervention and to more humane ways of supporting people. What we think we'll see is we'll see a relocation from one institution, namely police, to another institution, namely mental health services. What we're saying is that's all well and good insofar as it goes on the 3-lane highway, but don't forget the community lane. There are whole sets of possibilities in terms of alternatives, community alternatives to incarceration. But until we open up the conversation and actually ask the question, what are those alternatives? And we're prepared to put our money where our mouth is, I don't really think change is going to happen.
Yeah, thank you. Just to a different angle here, which is basically Daniel Green saying he heads up public health in Kingston in London, very pro ABCD, but how can we do that in COVID times when you can't meet people? Well, you know, how can we amplify communities to enable people to be together when they can't be?
Well, I suppose one of the things that really strikes me is we're working at the moment with Strathcarron Hospice outside Stirling. And it's been very, very inspiring to see how they've worked as a hospice. Now, what they've done is they've really changed the conversation, and they've said, you know, during COVID, many people will die at home. Some may have chosen to regardless of COVID, but many will, particularly certainly at the kind of the cusp of the challenge in March and April, will need to be supported in their own community. And yes, of course, people have to physically distance. And I would commend the use of the term physical distance in preference to social distancing, because I think people actually can remain social and physically distant. And it's been interesting to see how they've relocated some of their resource-employed community builders using some big lottery funding. And actually, they're saying as a hospice, we will be alongside communities while they figure out how to do death and dying during COVID. So I don't think it's either or. I think we have to figure out ways of pivoting into a pandemic conscious future. And part of that is how we remain social and in solidarity together while being savvy to the public health, very real public health and important health guidelines that we all should follow and take seriously.
And arguably, people are more attuned to the need for that everywhere. That leads us on to, there's a few questions around, there's an anonymous attendee has asked, how do you get the community on board? But let me also tie into that question from Ruth Devlin. Do you have recommendations or advice for communities themselves, including, says Ruth, poorer communities, but I'd say particularly poorer communities, working in the context of extremely resistant and recalcitrant councils where third sector organisations are weak? How do we do that? It's changing the paradigm in communities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So just maybe on the question around getting communities on board, I think the first thing is to recognise they're not always at sea. The assumption that they're on board or not on board is an interesting one, but I know what they mean. The first question I'd always ask is, on board with whose agenda? See, I think communities will get on board with what they care about, but there's a whole piece of setting our outside-in agendas aside and actually really giving folks a good listening to about what it is they do care about enough to take action on together. So that whole piece around that's really important, and enabling them to create space to figure out what it is they care about enough to act on together. So that's important. In terms of the question with regard to weak CVSs, very maybe imperial outside local and maybe central governments or whatever it might be, I think the critical thing here is when we think about subsidiarity, it's a principle in politics which says no bigger entity will do that which a smaller entity can do, even if the smaller entity doesn't do it as well. You know, another in the vernacular, a simple way of saying that is it's a misuse of power to solve problems that don't belong to us. One of the reasons that I think power and authority gets appropriated, it's kind of a form of colonization, is because we measure, in a lot of ways, we measure the success of interventions by how many people we turn into clients. So how many people we redefine out of community and into service land. And I think a very, very quick cheat, if you like, a hack into this would be to get serious about changing our measurements of success and actually saying that the measure of a success is how interdependent a person is in natural communities rather than dependent on services. Because the money that's churning around in terms of procurement and commissioning is stuck in service land rather than really kind of getting into the wider economy and communities. I think the other thing, and it's not easy, but the other thing that seems to be really important to attend to, and we've seen this in different parts of the world, is that even though at the very hyper-local level you may have a residents association, or you may have a neighbourhood watch, or you may have even a parish council, if the average age, and I'm in no way being ageist, but if the average age is typified at a certain end of life or, you know, whatever, and it's not inclusive of a diverse range of voices within the community, well, then we're sunk to begin with. So this is where I think 40 years of the absence of community development has really done us over in civic life. Somebody asked me earlier on, was I kind of demeaning the professional? No, I'm not. But what I am saying is if we're going to decenter professionals, so as much as anything they don't burn out, then we need to recenter citizens. And that's about building hyper-local capacity in the neighborhoods. We could talk more about how to do that, but we have practices for doing that at the very local level.
Well, it strikes me that one use of your book could be as a kind of self-help guide for communities, because surely this has to be driven from communities, in an old jargon, up, because there will be resistance to reach down. Yeah. So communities have to be resourced to know that this is even possible. I mean, maybe they do. Maybe I'm doing a misjustice. What do you think?
Well, it's the question, you know, around communities that have been economically marginalized or economically oppressed. You know, it's very interesting in most modern marketplace economies, when you're not needed for your productivity, you are needed for your consumption. You know, so we've commodified an awful lot of economically marginalized communities, and we've made, you know, if you think 2/3 of all monies intended to end poverty in Europe don't go to poor people. They go to people who are paid to service poor people.
Yeah.
So there's something about, you know, whether it's universal basic income or a kind of maybe a revamp of something like the GI Bill of Rights that says we're going to figure out a way of organizing our wealth so that those that are most marginalized are actually most valued. You know, we're going to look at what the advantaged in Scotland and do that for everybody. And we know that what advantages people, you know, you even take a jobs club. If I go to a jobs club from a certain, or from maybe any neighborhood, but from a neighborhood that's considered to be economically marginalized, and I go with a very strong social network, I'm 4 times more likely to get a job than if I just rely on the jobs club mediator. So there's something about how do we actually get all of these different offers that we're currently putting, excuse me, putting on the table together. Now, sorry.
Take a moment.
Now, one of the things that we have a real issue with, I think, across the world with regard to local governments is they're organized into silos. They don't organize themselves the way people organize their lives. So a very simple idea.
And that applies to smaller organizations as
Absolutely.
well. Yeah.
So, when I look at the impact over the years, and it's wobbling at the moment, politically of places like Seattle, where Seattle local government actually established a department of neighborhoods. Now, they still have all of the other departments, you know, recreations and waste management and whatnot. But this is the first time, 20 years ago, when I saw it, the first time I saw a local government say, let's organize ourselves the way people organize their lives. So I wouldn't say that in all instances, the community have to do it alone. There are examples and places where we've seen outside agencies really figure out how they could use their resources to enable community change. And I think we need both working together.
Now, this hour that we have goes incredibly fast, so I'm just going to huckle us along a little bit. But Dan Rouse is asking a question. He's a community coach and, you know, basically saying, expressing this, how do you help communities grow, has to be on their terms. I think we've heard you say that, and those are live issues. Dan, if you've got another question, I think we've heard Cormac answer that, but if you want further clarification, let me know, all right? Type it in again. Susan Scott is asking, if there are only so many resources, which there are, then we should be spending and using them on what people say helps them the most. How can we stop resources being wasted? I think that relates partly to the evaluation query evidence question, but Susan's saying the SG, Scottish Government, should have a close eye and influence this, but they seem not to be.
Yeah.
Is that your perception, that this conversation is not happening at government level in Scotland?
I think it is, and over the years it has. You know, it's probably just, it's hard to keep the memory alive. You know, so if you take the Our Place 2 initiative, the big lottery, that was a really, really good, you know, decade-long piece of solid work, which says to government and to communities, resource isn't just about services or expertise or programmatic interventions. Resource is also about social capital, but that's not going to be surfaced unless we connect it, and that's about community development. So we have evidence of this. You know, we have Sir Harry Burns' work, you know, around well-being. So we have a lot of really solid examples. I wonder whether the issue often is whether we just really struggle to bring these things together. And so my thought on this is we need to find a shared unit of change. And the unit of change isn't Scotland. It isn't the Scottish government, and it isn't the dysfunction of any given person or target group. It's the neighborhood, it's the village, it's the small bounded place. And the resources we need to start with is what are there and how can we help those be discovered, connected and mobilized? And then from that, extend those resources. The reason resources get wasted, it's a bit like putting water into sand, is when we do things top down to people and for people as though they're passive and they have no resources themselves. That's when resources get wasted and when people get really alienated and angry.
Now, I don't know if you've been following it, but Scotland has just started a major review of adult social care. It has to report by January. It's working at breakneck speed. What would you say to that review? Is there any application for ABCD in a setting like that? Yes,
absolutely. I mean, a couple of things. One is the speed at which they go needs to be the speed of trust. Not an election cycle or a funding cycle, but I appreciate documents need to be written because it actually, rather than being about a report, it needs to be about a nationwide conversation, you know, which might need to take a year, and maybe that's something to think about, that the actual discourse needs to say, we can't do this without the people on the ground. The second thing is places like Emilia Romagna in Italy show us where, you know, 1 in every 3 euro of their GDP is generated by cooperatives, show us that when there's very, very strong, not just social capital, but economic generating capacity, by goodness, if granny and granddad aren't looked after properly, or my son or daughter are being bused 400 miles to a service because we can't get it together in a local context, you're going to get pushback from people like that. So I think there is, again, something in social care about recognizing that social care, ironically, has become very antisocial and has become about business, not care. So in a lot of ways, we need to shift it out of service land, and we need to really go back into the families and the communities again and talk about what a good life looks like and how communities can be supported to step up around that and not just make it. I often say when I'm working in the States, you know, you take an institution like Medicare. The one thing I can assure you is they don't care. Because institutions don't care. Care is the freely given gift of the heart. It's created by communities. And when we start making communities the passive recipients of social care, as opposed to the creators of social care, we're sunk from the beginning. So we got to get back to basics and really start surfacing that conversation. And we will get pushback, because I think one of the things we've done for 30 years is we've created a narrative that says, you know, you tell us what your needs are, and we'll figure out a program to service them. And that conversation desperately needs to change, not to save money. It's not about saving the system money. It's about saving people from the system. It is not a good outcome to institutionalize people. So we need to figure out how to actually create lives, not services. And services are there to supplement a life. It's not meant to be air-conditioned misery. And in a lot of cases, that's what we're doing. We're segregating, and we are incarcerating in a lot of cases people. It's not okay, and it needs to change.
Now, we've covered, I think, the territory that a lot of the questions that have come in on the Q&A have been asking. So thank you so much for that. But to close, I wonder whether I can ask one final question that's come in. It's from an anonymous attendee, and it's saying, do you think that for all of us who are in a position to be thinking through ABCD, in whatever the setting, that we need to be imagining, accepting, and working towards our own obsolescence? If you could make it quite a tight answer, that would be great, Cormac Russell.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, all of us who've been around a little while in community development will remember a mentor at one point or another saying, your job is to work yourself out of a job. Okay, and I think that's a good lie to tell yourself. You know, it's a good idea. Another way into this, as a metaphor, which I might offer, is I think that there are two ways in which we approach change as professionals privileged to be paid to serve the public. And I use the metaphor of the miner with his helmet or her helmet on, you know, and the flashlight on the helmet. So it's the kind of classic image. One is we go at what we think is the problem with our pickaxe, and we get the light focused on that, and we chip away. The other is actually taking a step back and trying to illuminate the space, you know, and say, actually, there's a whole set of possibilities here, which if we could just discover, connect, and mobilize them a little bit more effectively, would change the nature of the conversation. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that I think some of this is about learning to lead by stepping back. In real terms, we have, and I've seen it in my own career as well, we've almost been forced in a lot of ways as professionals, and it's a real stress, to constantly produce, fix, solve problems, you know, hit a key performance indicator. Instead of saying, well, actually, an awful lot of how we can be of service to people is being alongside, listening, enabling them to actually see their own potential, connect them with other people. And I think a lot of that actually has been, you know, it's been demeaned and undervalued over time. I would suggest that what we could do is collectivize, start organizing, and CDSs are particularly well placed to do this. So we shift away from this idea that we're in the business of providing a fix for broken people called services, to we're in the business of social justice.
Thank you so much, Cormac Russell. Remind us of the title of your new book that's publishing right now, launching now.
So here we go. So it's called Rekindling Democracy, a Professional's Guide to Working in Citizen Space. And it's
available in all good bookstores everywhere, as they say. I think there'll be another print run required very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Before we finish the conversation, I'd like to introduce, please, David Bookbinder, who's going to do a bit of a third sector view summary. David is director of the Glasgow and West of Scotland Forum of Housing Associations. Welcome.
Thank you, Penny. May I apologise first for my sound quality. I hope you can hear me enough. Can you, Penny? Good.
It's coming through well, David. Yeah.
Good stuff. That was incredibly challenging and stimulating, and has made me think about some of the stuff that our community-controlled housing association sector does probably fits or fitted at one time into A, B, C, D, and probably a lot of what we do doesn't. And that's why it's challenging, I think, in ways in which we probably have to move on. I should first say, I mean, community-controlled housing associations, have something called rental income, as other associations do. That makes us a lot more secure than most third sector bodies, and therefore, I'm aware I can't pretend to speak for all kind of third sector bodies. We're probably on a greater, a more robust footing than many boroughs that have to struggle from one year to the next. Something that's really struck me is what really makes somebody stand up to do something in and for their community. What makes them moved or motivated or enthused. And it strikes me, and I want to give a couple of examples from history and from the present, that it strikes me that what you need most is a cause, an issue, a problem, a crisis. You need one of those things, by and large, to make you want to do something, to use your talent, your assets, your imagination to do something for your community. And the two obvious examples, 40 years ago, the community-controlled housing association movement came into being because people said, we don't want the council to pull down all the private tenements in Glasgow. And then into the 80s and 90s, it was council tenants saying, we've had enough of the way council housing is managed and run, and we want to do something about that. And that particularly affected Castlemilk, Drumchapel, Easterhouse, and some other areas plagued by poor local authority housing. Now, you can call that enlightened self-interest if you want to, but we obviously believe it was a genuine desire to improve the community for generations to come. Fast forward 40 years to COVID, and the speed at which 35 or 40 million quid's worth of money from the Scottish government got out within weeks of COVID and lockdown hitting, of money getting out to development trusts, to community anchor bodies like smaller local housing associations, working with even smaller local organisations, all with armies of existing and sometimes new volunteers, and how quickly that money got claimed and spent, and often, and it was interesting what you were saying, Cormac, about 2/3 of that money often goes to the people processing it and administering it, and so much of that 35 million quid went into fuel cards, food, money, to help people get through that very first stage. And that's the good, I think that's a good side, that there were small local organisations ready to roll on that. It didn't go through the local authority. I actually felt sorry for the council in Glasgow some ways, because they're standing there watching this money go out and get spent left, right and centre all around the different communities, and they're feeling quite not in control of it, and not exactly sure where all the money's going. So I do have a sympathy there for the local authority, but there's no doubt about it. The money got out really quickly because it didn't go through the local authority. If we're being truthful, some of the challenges that come out of that for us as associations very much resonate with what Cormac said. My God, that age issue. We need newer, younger committee members, but what's going to motivate them to volunteer to run their local housing association when the crisis is not what it was 40 years ago in terms of bad housing or bad management? Does an 18, 20 or 25-year-old really want to come to a 2-hour committee meeting on a January evening? That's a real challenge. I think COVID's gives us a lot of other challenges about discussion at meetings just nowhere near being as good as it is when you're doing it on Zoom as it is around the table. I think that's a real issue for us, but we'll get around that, and COVID, you know, fingers crossed, won't last forever. One of the things, though, I think we are challenged with is that we call ourselves community anchor bodies, but how near are we, or how dangerous are we to becoming the establishment? In a sense of we set ourselves up, we hope we speak for and work with communities, and we are run by volunteers in the community, but there's a fine line that a development trust or a local housing association, however small, starts becoming part of that establishment or being seen as that. But a huge amount of resonances and you know, keeping us on our toes, Cormac, because I think some of the ways that we do things are probably don't fall into the A, B, C, D category as much as they should do. So incredibly stimulating, and thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Cormac, we've got a few minutes left. So if you wanted to pick up, because I heard a lot of questions there still about, you know, how we introduce this, how we embed. What would you say in response?
Just a couple of brief reflections. David, thank you, first of all. That was great. And I agree with you. I think that COVID has been a precipitant, albeit a negative precipitant, which has galvanized an awful lot of communities. In some ways, it's been really interesting. It's almost like a hydraulic relationship, whereas the bigger institutions hit the limits of their capacity, we started seeing all of these invisible assets becoming visible again. And there's something in that, I think, about the relationships, almost like a hydraulic pump. And we just need to be thoughtful about that stepping back. So I think that's actually a positive thing in terms of learning for bigger institutions like NHS trusts and indeed local governments. How can they actually make a virtue of stepping back and call that community development, you know, and see that that actually has a place. But the other thing is just very practical, almost granular. We know from our work that 85% of people will not show up in civic life if the only duck call or the only, you know, come join invitation is come to a meeting or come be a volunteer. Neither of those things are wrong in themselves. It's just they only attract the ducks that like meeting and volunteering. And as we know, across it, will respond to the invitation, come to a meeting or come and be a volunteer. It's really, really interesting to see how so often, particularly central governments, keep thinking that citizenship in total is about volunteering. And it so is, but it's so much more as well, that volunteering is just a subset. So that other thought around meetings is, why have a meeting when you can have a party? You know, so beginning to find other ways for people to show up. What would you love to do on your street if 3 neighbours helped you? I think what became really clear for a lot of people during COVID, particularly in April, was if we don't do this, it won't get done. And as you say, David, the fact that money was able to hit the spots, it was really the Heineken strategy. It hit the parts it doesn't normally hit. And I think that was partly because people were ready to receive it, as well as, you know, the infrastructure was better at getting it out there.
The time is right for these conversations. Thank you so much. In the last few seconds left, I just wanted not only to thank Cormac Russell so much for his big idea, which again I will be taking away and thinking about all week. Next week, on the 18th of September at 11 a.m, we have another OWR session, this time given by Dr. Janet Whiteley from the Scottish Government on collective leadership. That's 11 a.m. on the 18th of September. If you have enjoyed this, if you think other people need to listen to this interview, this discussion, this recording, and you'd like to share it, you're going to be able to find it online. The information will be easily accessed. If you would like to tweet about it, please hashtag OWR Big Ideas and at Glasgow GCVS. I hope to catch up with you, some of you next week. Thank you so much for your questions. Thank you so much for your answers, and catch you later. Goodbye.